Picture this. A battlefield somewhere in Britain. The sky is low and grey, the ground turned to mud by rain and blood. A leader lies dying, armour dented, shield split, his banner trampled into the earth. His companions carry him toward the mist, towards a waiting boat. Later, people will swear he didn't die at all, that he sailed to a hidden island, and that one day he'll return when Britain needs him most. We know his name, or we think we do. King Arthur. But here's the twist. The closer we look at the history behind that scene, the more it slips through our fingers. Today, we're going to pull Arthur's story apart. The myth, the potential man, the very real medieval politics that needed a perfect king, whether he existed or not.
Welcome to Isles of Stories.
Hello, and welcome to the channel. I just wanted to give a bit of background about my interest in King Arthur. Something I've been mildly obsessed with since childhood. A wonderful story dating back 1500 years as a minimum. Today we're going to look at various different aspects of that, and I'll dive into that shortly, but I wanted to give a bit of perspective around my own interest in King Arthur. I am not somebody who likes the Holy Grail aspect, for example. It never really caught my interest as a King Arthur story. I'm not that keen on Excalibur, the 80s movie around King Arthur. Contrast that with Merlin, the Channel 4 series with Sam Neill and Helena Bonham Carter. That's my preferred way of looking at Arthur. I like the mystical, the mythological. But there's no denying that there is a lot of people who are interested in all different aspects of the king. And so, what are we even talking about today? Let's start with the world Arthur is supposed to belong to. Most versions place him in the 5th or early 6th century, the time after the Roman Empire pulled its legions out of Britain. Roman rule effectively ends around the 400s AD. Towns shrink, long-distant trade falters, and messy patchworks of local rulers fight over what's left. Historians call this the sub-Roman Britain. Not quite the organised Roman province it was, but not yet the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms we learn about later. It's a time of former Roman elites trying to hang on to power, incoming groups like the Angles and the Saxons settling, fighting, both. Christianity surviving in some places, while older beliefs still linger in others. It's also a time with very few written records from Britain itself. Almost everything we have was written long after the events, or from outside Britain, or both. And that's our first problem. If Arthur really was a great war leader who united the Britons and smashed the Saxons in battle after battle, we'd hope to have a contemporary note, a letter, a smug inscription saying, "I, Arthur, beat these guys." We don't. At least, not directly. The earliest glimpses of Arthur are interesting. Where exactly does he show up? Well, the first widely accepted, clearly debatable reference to Arthur appears in a Latin work called the Historica Britannum. Again, my pronunciation will be off here. History of the Britons, though, written dated around 828 AD, although 3 centuries after his supposed lifetime. In this text, Arthur isn't called king, he's described as Dux Bellorum, a leader of battles, fighting alongside British kings against the Saxons. The author lists 12 battles, including the famous Battle of Badon, where Arthur supposedly carried the image of the Virgin Mary on his shield and won a huge victory. Then there's the Annals Cembri, again pronunciation, I apologise, and the Welsh Annals, compiled in the 10th century. They mention the Battle of Badon, dated around 516, the Battle of Camlan, where Arthur and Mordred fell, around 537. Again, these entries are centuries later, and only a line or two each. No Round Table, no Camelot, no Lancelot, just a name attached to battles and a death. There may be an earlier poetic echo of Arthur's fame in the Welsh poem, again pronunciations, E Godin, where a warrior is compared to Arthur as a measure of greatness. But the dating and interpretation of that line are debated. So, in these early sources, Arthur is a mighty warrior, not necessarily a king, famous enough to be a benchmark of heroism, but still a shadowy war leader than a king that we know from later stories. The more familiar Arthur, the one with Merlin, Excalibur, Camelot and all the rest, doesn't really arrive until the 12th century. And that's where things start to get political. Geoffrey of Monmouth is a name well associated with King Arthur. In the 1130s, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a book with a grand title, Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. And Geoffrey does not do things by halves. He takes the scattered mentions and legends of Arthur and spins them into a huge, sweeping pseudo-history. He gives Arthur a noble lineage, connecting him to earlier legendary kings. He makes him King Arthur, not just a war leader. He includes Merlin, Guinevere, Excalibur, great victories against Saxons, Scots, Picts, even campaigns on the continent. Geoffrey presents all this as history, but even many medieval readers were suspicious. There's no earlier evidence for most of what he writes, and he claims to be translating an otherwise unknown ancient book. It's probably fair to say Geoffrey is doing a mix of creative writing, something I've tried my hand at, myth compilation, word-of-mouth stories passed down over the generations, falling on his ears, and political storytelling. What he absolutely does, though, is make Arthur famous. His book spreads across Europe. It's translated, adapted, and becomes the foundation of much of Arthurian legend. This is the point where Arthur goes from being a semi-legendary Welsh-British war hero to the once and future king, the ideal ruler and world-class conqueror. And medieval rulers notice. If you're a medieval king, Geoffrey's version of Arthur is incredibly useful. Here's the legendary British ruler who unites warring factions, defeats invaders, rules with justice and strength, and builds an empire of sorts. What better figure to claim as your own ancestor or predecessor? Norman and later Plantagenet rulers in England pick up Arthur as a kind of mascot of legitimacy. Some present themselves as heirs to Arthur's legacy, the ones who will restore or surpass his greatness. Stories of Arthur's return, that he's not really dead, just sleeping in Avalon, again, one of my preferred stories, becomes a double-edged sword. For local populations, they can be a myth of hope. The true king will come back and fix everything. Some rulers associating themselves with Arthur is a way of implying, actually, you know what, I'm Arthur, I'm the one that returned. Arthurian imagery, though, appears in royal ceremonies, literature sponsored by courts, and in the broader culture of chivalry. He becomes less of a specific historical figure and more of a symbol of ideal kingship. In other words, whether or not he existed becomes less important than what he represented. He was a tool, and a potent one at that. But how does the legend keep evolving from here? After Geoffrey, other writers take Arthur and run with him. In the 12th and 13th centuries, French and Anglo-Norman authors expand and reshape the story. They introduce Lancelot, Guinevere's lover, turning Arthur's court into a stage for tragic romance and betrayal. They add the Holy Grail, connecting Arthurian legend to Christian mysticism and spiritual quests. They develop the idea of the Round Table, a symbol of equality among knights, even though Arthur is still very much the boss. By the late Middle Ages, especially with the works of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, we get the version of the story that still shapes most modern retellings. Gleaming plate armour that didn't exist in Arthur's supposed time, tournament culture, and highly codified chivalry. Basically a late medieval world projected backwards onto a Dark Age warlord? Maybe Roman warlord? Who knows? So if your mental image of Arthur involves knights in polished armour, jousting and castle banquets, that's not 6th century Britain, that's later medieval Europe, dressing the story up in its own clothes for its own needs and wants. So, was there a real Arthur? This is the big question that unfortunately nobody is going to be able to or can offer an honest, convincing answer to. Underneath the legends and the politics, was he real? What did he do? Where did he go? What happened to him? We don't know, and we will never know. What we can say is the period fits. There definitely were battles between local British rulers and incoming Anglo-Saxons in the 5th and 6th centuries. This part is undisputed. The Battle of Badon is mentioned independently. A near contemporary writer, Gildas, writing in the 6th century, talks about a great British victory at a place called Badon against Saxon forces. He doesn't mention Arthur by name, but the events fit the kind of story that later gets attached to him. The fact that Arthur appears in Welsh sources, annals and poetry suggests that someone by that name or title was associated with heroic resistance. From there, historians and enthusiasts have proposed all sorts of theories. Arthur is a Roman British commander, perhaps based somewhere in Western Britain, as seen by the film not too long ago, in fact, with Clive Owen in the titular role and Keira Knightley as a sort of Guinevere Pictish lady. There is also obviously Arthur as a title, not a name, possibly linked to the Latin Artorius. Arthur also could be a composite figure, blending several war leaders into one superheroic memory. But there is a problem that we keep coming back to. All the sources that name Arthur as the hero of these battles are much later than the events they describe. There's no contemporary inscription, no official Roman or post-Roman document saying Arthur did this, or Arthur was here. If Arthur existed, he may actually have been a capable but perhaps not unique war leader whose story was snowballed, or someone whose real achievements were dramatically exaggerated over time, or even a completely legendary figure who grew out of heroic folklore rather than a single human life. The evidence just isn't strong enough to provide a definitive historical Arthur. And yet, his story persists. Before we go on to why Arthur doesn't go away, it's worth mentioning, in my humble opinion, that a lot of people flat out say King Arthur didn't exist. And I think, whilst there is no proof he did, there is also no proof he didn't. And that is one of the reasons why I think he hangs around, and why a lot of us, when we are young and hear the story of King Arthur, we actually buy into it. We want it to be real. And in these troubled times that we live in now, wouldn't it be nice if someone did come along, not as a king or a brutal tyrant, many of which we already have in the world, but as somebody who could unite the people? I feel, perhaps if it's a fairy tale of my own making, that would be quite nice. But why doesn't Arthur go away? Why are there people such as myself who 1600 years later are still interested in King Arthur? Well, there's a few reasons. First, he's a perfect narrative container. You can pour almost anything into Arthurian legend. Heroic resistance against invasion, the dream of a just, unified kingdom, romantic tragedy, religious quests, political propaganda, all round just fantasy, magic, dragons. The legend is flexible enough to be continuously rewritten for new authors. Over the last 20 years I've read numerous books, some of them treating Arthur as the hero, even some treating him as the villain of the piece. All very interesting in their own rights. The second reason why he persists is he sits at a crossroads of history and myth. As I said, they cannot prove one way or the other whether he existed or not. Arthur's world is close enough to real events, the Roman withdrawal, the Saxon migration, post-imperial chaos, that it just seems plausible. But it's far enough away and poorly documented enough that the myth can move in and fill the gaps. He embodies a question that never really goes away. What does a truly just ruler look like? Medieval writers imagined one answer: a king supported by wise advisors, brave knights, divine favour. Modern versions sometimes question whether that king ever existed or whether the perfect ruler in itself is a myth, used by those in power to justify their own rule. Now, let us return to where we started. Let's go back to that battlefield. A defeated war leader, a misty horizon, a boat slipping into legend. Maybe there really was such a man, scars on his arms, mud on his boots, who fought a desperate series of battles to hold his world together for just a little longer. Maybe there wasn't. But over the centuries, chroniclers, poets and kings took that shadow and built something far bigger. A king who never quite dies. A promise that a perfect ruler will return someday to heal the land. And that might be the most dangerous and powerful part of the story. Because whenever someone tells you they are the one who will restore a lost golden age, it's worth asking, are we hearing history, or are we listening to the latest version of King Arthur? Well everybody, that's a wrap for the first video of Isles of Stories, King Arthur. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you would consider liking and subscribing onto my channel. I have more videos coming up, and there will be something on Boudicca soon. So thank you very much, and see you on the next one.